you know the drill. If anything comes up, we can just stop and don't, I'm not, I actually did an interview yesterday, and the guest's cat kept jumping onto the screen, and that's okay. I have no problem with that. I always welcome animals into the show. So,
Yeah. What are you gonna
um,
do?
exactly. You know what? I trying to figure out how to start this conversation because, uh, you know, listening to your book, it just had my head spinning in so many ways. My focus, though, was to see how we covered this topic as journalists, and it's a conversation I'm sure lots of newsrooms are having. I hope they are having, and I know that we're having. But so many things that you brought up made me think about the last couple of years. But let me just start with this though. How often are you talking to newsrooms and reporters about the issue of race? And I'm just wondering the type of questions that you get.
So, I started a nonprofit called Headway, which is focused pretty narrowly right now on bringing racial equity and reform to public media in particular. So, I am talking to newsrooms quite a bit. Um, Generally, if they're calling me, it's because something has gone wrong. Um, and
Oh,
so it's very often crisis management at that point. Um, what I try to tell people is we have to change our tactics and move away from these crisis reaction to a reactionary, um, to being proactive and creating muscle memory in an institution, especially a newsroom, because when you have muscle memory, it means that even when people quit, even when new people come in, the institution itself knows how to be equitable and fair and just. There are systems in place that are just automatically equitable and fair and just. It's not about accommodating personalities. And so that's sort of what I try to get across to people is not let's deal with this crisis. Let's find the root causes of it. Let's bring up all those undiscussables that nobody's talking about and get to the root of what created the tension here. In news business, and this, um, we are especially prone to racial bias and discrimination. And a big part of that is because we rely on gut instinct a lot. We call it news instinct, but it's really gut instinct. And gut instinct is the most vulnerable kind of thinking that to discrimination and bias and unconscious and implicit biases. You think a news story is important because you think it is, but really there's all these unconscious biases making you think that economic story about Boeing is more important than the story about the Latino community in Detroit or whatever it may be. So it makes us vulnerable.
The one of the things that kept popping up for me, and I do tend to overanalyze. So I was stressed about thinking over the last couple of years the way we covered the Black Lives Matter marches, and we had them here in South Florida, and in a couple of cases, the tension between police and marchers it escalated to the point where people were getting shot with obviously with the rubber bullets and things like that. But then I stopped to think about it. I do a show with two producers, and none of us are black. It's me, a Latino Hispanic man. I had a Latino Hispanic Latinx producer. I had and then a white producer. And I mean, I think that we're all good people. We're all trying. We're working really hard, and we're sitting there asking, what are the issues? What do we need to talk about? Who do we need to talk to? And then later it hit me, and I said, but did we cover this the right way? Did we, because and I agree with you that whether we want to admit it or not, we all have a bias, and I'm trying to figure out, oh God, what is mine? And as a host, did I do this right? And I did stress a lot about that. But I wonder when you talk to, and I'm sure when you go to newsrooms, you'll see the disparity. You'll see that there aren't enough black voices in many newsrooms. So how we covered this topic. did we do a good job or not?
The thing of it is that the newsrooms, unless you're at the network, and even if you are at the network, frankly, because every show is its own individual team, um, your team is never going to be big enough to incorporate every voice that you cover. You're not going to be able to have the blind community and the elderly community and the Hmong community. You're not going to be able to have all of that. So we really have to make these relationships with our communities and invite them to give us feedback. We have to invite people outside of our teams even to take a listen and say, did I do this right? Can you take a half hour, listen to the story, and give me feedback? And we have to be doing that regularly. It has to be part of our process that we do the story and then we seek out different voices to take a critical listen and let us know what we missed. Um, Once you have a team that does that enough, you start getting better at identifying your blind spots. It doesn't mean you stop reaching out for that feedback, but you do start to get better at identifying blind spots because, again, you can't rely on having a diverse enough team to include every single voice. That doesn't mean you don't want a diverse team. I mean, obviously, you want as diverse as you can get. But, if you're in Miami, diversity means a member of the Latino or Hispanic community. That's, you know, if you're in Atlanta, diversity is going to look a lot like a lot of Black people.
Hmm.
So if you're in North Dakota, uh, you know,
No,
you
exactly.
might be able to get an indigenous person, but that you're going to be mostly white people. So you
Mhm.
have to create these systems in which you are actually have a brain trust of people who are watching your back for you, and they're not just watching your back to look for mistakes. This isn't just about liability; it's about learning, about allowing your learning curve to always be on the upswing.
One of the things I loved about your book is that the approach, and I, I agree completely that I think we all just are living in a combative state and we're just ready to fight.
Yeah.
And we don't, I don't think we think about our beliefs enough, but when somebody challenges it, we're ready to just, no, I've got facts, I'm ready. But I love how you lay out, look, you have to unarm somebody first. Empathy is a big part of this, and then and make them feel comfortable with you before you even go
Yeah.
into that topic. But here's the thing: as a reporter, as a journalist, this is challenging. Going back to the Black Lives Matter marches of a couple of years ago, one of the things that kept popping up, and this has been a real big challenge, is well, we've seen the reaction from a particular party, the party on the right, and how they've reacted to this. And I don't need to tell you, I think you've seen everything that's been going on in Florida. And then, of course, their pushing of laws that, you know, as a human, you just stop and say, that's just racist. But as a reporter, you're like, how am I supposed to talk to this guy or this woman, this congressional leader, or this state senator? Approach them without starting a fight, but to point out, why did you pass this law? Why do you believe what you believe? That's been a challenge. Granted, I've also seen, I'm not getting a lot of Republicans on the show lately, but that's popped up. And I wondered your take on how to approach that.
So I think media writ large is kind of responsible for, in a small part, responsible for where we are. And that has been um, number one, even at NPR, we took the lazy man sort of cowardly way out for quite a long time, meaning that we did the he said she said, the false balance, where rather than putting our own reputation on the line, because NPR kept getting attacked as being liberal, which is not true. They've done research studies. It's not true. But they kept getting attacked as liberal. And so, in order to fix that, they would just always include an opposing voice. Right. And you can't have an opposing voice on climate change or the safety of vaccines. Right.
Right.
It's just not, that's not feasible. But that's what we did. And so it created a little bit of this combative environment. I'm not taking full responsibility, just a little. So when you are approaching somebody like that, I always like to approach them from the standpoint of how wide the agreement is. So for example, if I were reporting in Florida, I would say, this, I'm confused and I'm really hoping you can clear this up because I'm super curious about your standpoint on this. We know that the you know support for LGBTQ communities, support for same-sex marriage is incredibly popular in the United States. That's something that's bipartisan that everybody agrees on. So let's dig into what it is that you're trying to prevent here. Give me the example of the real world example of what you're trying to prevent. You have to really use those 5 whys, Toyota's 5 whys. You have to really dig down into specific examples. The problem becomes when you start talking in generalities. The liberal agenda, the gay agenda, you're never ever, that's just talking points. You're never going to find anything of use in that conversation. You have to drill it down to specific stories, specific examples, what they specifically have experienced. What did their kids experience if they have children that went through? What books did they like growing up? If they liked Clifford the Big Red Dog, like have them give you specific examples. How did they learn to read? How did they learn math? What are they concerned about? That then you can get into the nitty gritty and you can get it out of um, this idea of winners and losers and get it more into people's stories. We tell ourselves we know this. It's about telling stories. And yet when it comes to politics and also economics, we don't do that. We allow people to give us talking points instead of specific true stories.
I don't know if my producers will be happy with me bringing up Clifford the Big Red Dog the next time I talk to a Republican, but
I mean,
no, no, no. But you know what? But one of the interesting things is that, like, say for example, one of the big controversies right now in Florida, as you know, is that they've passed this what Republicans like to call the anti woke law, and so now parents can challenge any book, anything on the curriculum, and they've already started banning a bunch of books. And their argument is going to be, well, it's got CRT in it, critical race theory in it. And then we keep coming back with the same thing. But superintendents, teachers, library unions have said there's no CRT in public schools. And they come back and say, we found it. Prove it. We found it. And then I find myself stuck in a circle, going in a circle. It's like, and that was one of the things. Like, reporters challenged them. They banned
yeah,
a
I've
dozen
seen
math
them.
books. Yeah, they banned a dozen math books. Prove it, show it. They showed 4 little examples, but they won't say anything else. Then what? Now we're just going in circles.
Yeah,
It's
I
really
don't
frustrating.
report that. I don't include that interview.
Okay.
Um, I have said to people before, I can't use that. That's not, you're not giving me an example. I can't use this. I
Mm.
can't use this. I can't use this. I can't use this. And then I will put in a statement saying, we spoke to blah 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 blah. They, and I'll give a summation of what they said. They insist with no evidence that there's examples of CRT in the textbooks, but I always have to say with no evidence. Like, I'm nobody's patsy. And one thing I learned after the Iraq War is that you just cannot allow someone else to control the story. Just because somebody says this is about CRT, that doesn't mean that's what I'm reporting. It was kind of like, I was hosting Here and Now, and after the elections, the French election results,
Mm.
one of the biggest headlines everyone was broadcasting was how well the far right did. This was this huge victory for the far right. Yes, but this was the first time in 2 decades that a sitting president in France had been reelected. And that margin by which Macron won was massive. If a president in the United States won by that margin, we would call it a slam dunk victory. So we have to constantly step back and be realistic about what it is that somebody's saying and not buy into the the escalation of the narrative. And it's the same thing with CRT. Look, it's difficult to cover this because they're not honest actors in
Mhm.
this. And I think that we have to stop pretending like they are honest actors. We have to stop pretending like that interview is usable. It's not usable. If I were to speak to somebody doing a man on the street tape, and they gave me a completely garbled garbage talking about their niece and then nutmeg and then, whatever, I wouldn't use it. I'd be like, this is unusual tape. And I find it's the same way with politicians when they're saying irrational things. I just don't use it.
Yeah, we got to start taping some of our conversations. Going live is tricky. I wanted to ask you about this. You've been in the business a while,
Yeah.
and I think about where I've been. Most of my career has been local. So as you pointed out, depending on where you are, the newsroom is going to look a certain way, and most newsrooms I've been in have been very white. The bigger the city I got into, obviously the diversity was better. But in for just your experience and in your travels and all everywhere you've been, have things gotten better, or are we still way behind?
Yes. They have gotten better and we're still way behind.
Okay.
um at the same time that we are seeing some improvement in recruitment of diverse staff, for example, this year, over the past year, we've seen an unprecedented exodus of talent from public radio, not just the network. That's what makes the headlines when Audie Cornish resigns, but even at local stations, and it has especially been women of color, which means that we have thrown all our energy into recruiting diverse talent and not thrown enough energy into creating inclusive environments where they can feel supported and feel that they have a chance for promotion and growth.
Mm,
It's funny. I was talking to somebody at NPR about the bureau system. NPR has bureau chiefs in different regions of the country, and they're generally the portal through which local reporters get their stories on national air.
mm,
And I said, okay, so um, how many? Where's the a record of the stories they've turned down? And they said, we don't keep a record of the pitches they turn down. And I said, okay, well, where's your record of which stories they've accepted that were successful versus the ones that weren't? And they said, we don't keep a record of that. And I said, okay, well, then how do you know how biased your bureau chiefs are? A, they're 100% older white people. How do you know if they're biased or not if you don't know what stories they're turning, if you're keeping no metrics? Um, and they said, I don't know. And I was like, well, you have a complaint where a black reporter in Atlanta pitched a story about Kamala Harris's sorority, and the bureau chief turned it down. And not that long later, a white reporter pitched a very similar story and it was accepted.
mm,
How do you know if that was bias or not, or a fluke? And they don't have any way of doing so. So when I talk about retention, this is sort of part of it, or growth or promotion. As a reporter, growing in this industry has a lot to do with how many stories you get on the network. That's one of your bragging rights, right? Your news director usually wants you to be getting stories in the network because then all their listeners and their donors hear your call letters, right? From station WDET in Detroit, blah, 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 blah. So these portals of power that we don't give a lot of thought to are just they're not being recorded. They're not being measured. We don't keep track at all if a bureau chief is good or bad because we don't know how good they are at their jobs.
mm. Wow, did not think of that. Interesting. So it's at a management level. It's at a management level where we have to start.
I mean, always, but it's a systemic level that we have to start. We've approached diversity so badly, and I write about this in the book. We have to stop thinking that racism and ageism and any of the isms are a knowledge problem. And I just did mandatory sexual harassment training. That's what I just did before I got on the line with you. Um, and For the most part, we approach it as though we have to teach people how bad racism is and discrimination is. Um, and we have to show them examples of discrimination and say, see how bad this is? Look how much this hurts this other person. Everybody knows that.
Hmm.
Everyone knows racism is bad. Everyone knows sexism is bad. They just don't think they're racist or sexist, because the vast majority of discrimination and bias you're going to encounter is the product of unconscious bias or implicit bias.
Yeah.
And so we have to, it's not so much that whether it's at a management level or not, it's that we have to create systems that are about behavioral science, that are about either rewarding inclusive behavior and punishing exclusive behavior. We have to create those systems. So, for example, I was working with very large station in which, after a series of surveys, we discovered their news pitching process was a real problem. And I went through the same thing. Okay, who's accepting the pitches? How do you know if they're good at their jobs? What are the stories they're turning down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? They kept no record. And so I said, okay, you have to start A, including other people in the pitching process. You can create a rotating calendar in which literally everybody in the newsroom, including interns, gets to be part of that discussion on what stories get accepted and what don't. Otherwise, you're not taking advantage of your diversity. And B, you have to keep a record of which stories, which pitches were turned down.
Mm.
Um, and that becomes your system. And that's about management, but it's really about the process.
I do love that you point, and you've pointed it out a couple of times now, and it's just that bias exists, and we don't think about it. When I read that part of your book, I started laughing because the first thought that came to mind was years ago. I was at the time with dating this woman. We went to a Broadway show. We went to watch Avenue Q. Did you see that show?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So anybody who didn't see it, there's a song in the show called "Everybody's a Little Bit Racist," and I always recall that evening because it's a funny song. It's a funny show. And I turned to my girlfriend at the time and just laughed and said, "It's kind of sad that it's true." And then I stopped and I looked across the crowd and realized I don't think there are any black people in this audience right now. We're all laughing at a song, and I don't know. Do we even understand what's happening right now? And it was one of those weird moments, I think. Um, but I'm thinking about where that's popping up, and uh, one of the things I'm grateful for is that I work with a lot of young people, and I'm grateful for my producers who are a lot younger than I am, because they do point out things that I'll admit it that yes, that I'm probably thinking and speaking in a bias all the time, because as the world is changing, there are things we don't say anymore, and I'm like, oh, but that's how I grew up saying that stuff. And so I think about the fact that I used to make fun of my father. Dad, we don't talk like that anymore. You're so old. Now I'm my father. And now I'm the guy everybody's telling me, we don't say those words. Um, but I'm grateful for that opportunity to
I
have
mean, look,
people
I
around me.
work
Yeah.
in this business and I screw up all the time. I try to include my own mistakes, a few of them, in the book,
Mm.
because we have to stop making those mistakes the equivalent of being a racist.
Right.
Right? We have to stop making mistakes in pronouns be the equivalent of being transphobic or homophobic. We have to give the mistakes the attention they deserve, which is like, whoops, you probably didn't intend that. But just let me know. I'm just going to let you know that's we don't use that phrase anymore.
Something else that I wanted to ask you about, and this was one of the more powerful moments I think I've ever had on air, is, as we're covering the race issues here in South Florida. And when I say that, I think I should clarify that again, about talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and all the response to it. I had a conversation once with a gentleman here who's a professor at FIU, black gentleman, one of my favorite people to talk to because he's a historian who's trying to protect that history of South Florida, the black history of South Florida. But I said to him once, I said, I've heard that police officers are, it's not so much that they're racist, but that they are afraid of black men. They're afraid of black men, and it was a study from Los Angeles that I'd pulled that from. It was an NPR story, and he said, so "I'm afraid of black men." And then I just kind of froze. I said, "I don't even know where to go with this at this point." But it made me think about how we're reporting on crime in the city. If you have a shooting like the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting, which is at a predominantly white school, compared to how many black children are dying from guns in other neighborhoods, it's the equivalent, sadly. But we don't talk about that enough. We don't report about that enough, and because maybe we're viewing black men a certain way. And it got me thinking about it. And I again, it's one of these things. I'm trying to wrap my brain around this. How am I doing my job? Am I doing my job right?
Yeah. There's a famous, and I think I probably quoted it, but there was a famous comment from Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jesse Jackson, obviously former presidential candidate, marched with Martin Luther King, um, in which he said that he too, if he hears footsteps coming up behind him, he gets nervous, and then he sees they're white young men and he relaxes. We have to be careful. I hear white people using that a lot as a justification or kind of an absolution to say, look, everybody's racist. There's a difference between those who are racist and who perpetuate it or who benefit from it, and those who are victims of it. So that's first. But Beverly Daniels Tatum says that racism is like smog, that you can't escape it. You breathe it in. And it doesn't matter how diverse you are. I mean, look, I'm Black and Jewish and Buddhist, and I was a single mother most of my life. And like, I check off a huge number of boxes. And yet, of course, I am biased. I just wrote a small ebook, a short ebook for Scribd called You're Cute When You're Mad, Simple Steps for Confronting Sexism. And the first thing I did as I began to research for that was to take the implicit association tests from Harvard that related to gender. And I'm super sexist. Like, my results were you have a strong preference for women in the home and men at work. And that's upsetting to understand. But I've been breathing in sexism since I watched Happy Days and the Brady Bunch as a very, very young child. So of course I have been affected by those sexist ideas. Of course, Black children have been affected by racist ideas about themselves and their own families. And it's horrible. But again, the people who have the power to change it, if you're going to rank them, right at the top are white dudes. And then it comes down from them. Just below them are white women. So in terms of those who are benefiting from racism, it's white dudes and white women. And those also happen to the people who have the most power to change it.
Let me just finish with this. Thinking about the other thing too is our newsrooms may have, in some places, may have that diversity. And I'll be the first to admit that I haven't seen all the statistics, but I every now and then I do go and speak with the station manager about our listeners, and just I want to get a sense, who are our listeners? Do we get? I want to know, because for me, for my show, it's like I really want to reach a lot of groups, younger, not just the older, but younger, and I want to reach. We're in South Florida. I want to reach more Hispanic, Latino, Latinx people. Why aren't we doing that? I don't get that. What am I doing wrong? But yeah, the public radio audience still predominantly white. Do you think that subconsciously we're trying to cater to them in some way?
I don't even think it's fully subconscious in all cases. Yes, it's subconscious, but it's also blatant. I mean, I remember at one point we were doing a story, the census had just came out, so this must have been 2010. And we were doing a story about the fact that, not too long from now, white people will not be the majority. They will not make up the majority of the country. And one of our executives said, I would not phrase it that way because that just makes our listeners really upset and nervous and afraid.
Wow.
Yeah. Um, that's of course, as long as we continue to gear our programming toward that audience, that's who our audiences will be. If you build it, they will come. Um, so yeah, and I remember this was at the time when the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, was being debated, and I had to fight tooth and nail. We did a full week long coverage of it, lots and lots of stories, lots of interviews, and I had to fight like the Dickens to get a story on about racial disparities in healthcare. And they were like, "That's not what this is about." I'm like, "If you're a person of color, that is all this is about." When it comes to insurance, it's you having the exact same insurance as the white dude next to you, and you don't get as good of care. Of course, that has to be part of the debate over any kind of legislation. But they were like, no, that's a tangent. Like, that's a totally different subject. Let's keep that for Black History Month. I mean, yeah, we are, in some cases, it is subconscious, but it is also blatantly subconscious. If that makes sense. Um, and I should also say, I lead this group Headway, and we issued an open letter last year, detailing, very detailed, into what reforms need to happen in public media in order to make it equitable and just. And one of the sections was on getting rid of the idea of objectivity, for example, and just dumping it because it's racist and sexist in nature. And I got a phone call from a major, major funder saying, we can't support this letter unless you remove the part about objectivity. Because our mission is to be objective. That's our mission. Um, and so, it's built in. It's the ghost in the machine.
Yeah, you know what? And thank you for saying that, because and this is something I was educated on when I moved to South Florida. Even though, again, with my background, it's not something that I was thinking about, and I grew up with that idea. Nope, as a journalist, this is where I need to stand on things. It started years back with some of the journalists here in Miami, the Latino journalists who started to speak up about immigration issues, and people telling them, "Hey, you're a journalist. You're not supposed to take sides." But they're coming at it from a very different. Nobody wanted to see their perspective, and then of course, understanding then my black friends who were journalists and how they responded. I having that education, I realized, oh, I get it. Okay, I've already learned this. And the same thing with and with the Me Too movement, and any female that I worked with, it's like, I get it. Okay, yeah, this idea of objectivity, we need to rethink this and how we are approaching our jobs.
Yeah,
When
and for those who are interested, there's a great book from Lewis Raven Wallace called "The View from Somewhere: Undoing the Myth of Journalistic Objectivity." Lewis was fired from Marketplace because he wrote blogs about being trans and how the recent debate was, affecting his life. And Marketplace is like, well, if you have a point of view on these trans issues, then you're not objective. You're fired.
I remember that story.
I mean,
Yeah.
how do I not have an opinion on my life and my safety? I'm not sure, but it's the same thing as like Black Lives Matter. How are you going to go to a black person and say you can't take a point of view on Black Lives Matter? What?
Well, I know.
What? Um, no, transparency is the way. And I had to do a bunch of interviews about the Confederate flag after the massacre at the church, and there was a real reconsideration of the Confederate flag in the South, and I was broadcasting out of Atlanta at that point. And I just started, every time we had an interview like that, I would say, look, I'm black. My family was on a plantation in Georgia. I obviously have strong feelings about the Confederate flag, but I'm going to be fair. And if I'm not, call us, email us if you hear me being unfair.
Mm.
My goal is not to be objective. My goal is to be fair. And that, yeah, objectivity's got to go.
By the way, when is that the ebook that you wrote? When is that coming out?
That actually came out. It's Scribd exclusive.
Oh, okay.
I came up with the name myself, but I am proud of it because you're cute and you're mad is so enraging. Uh, I think it says it all there. That book is focused on benevolent sexism.
Hmm.
Let me get that for you, hon.
No.
Celeste, why don't you take notes during the meeting? Your handwriting is so good. All those little sweet, friendly, you'd be such a good mother. Um, Things that we say that we don't always recognize as sexism, which research shows are as damaging, if not more damaging, than blatant sexism. So,
I tell you what, and again, I'm lucky. I work in this multi generational office, and that you mentioned that, and it's just a great conversation that I tend to hear. I hear a lot with one of my coworkers, Christine, who is, I think she's a boomer. She's a Gen Xer or a boomer. But and then we have a lot of millennials, and when they start talking about sexism, and then she'll talk about what she grew up with and how the world has changed. And I just sit back and I'm like, oh, this is like a master class. I'm learning. I'm learning. I better not forget about this. But no, you're right. All of these things we don't think about it, and it's. But I really appreciate the book because I think that the thing that stood out for me, and I really thank you for this, is that uh, you know, don't go in trying to change somebody. Just start a conversation with somebody, find some things in common. I love that. I love that. You know what? I love you brought up uh, what was it called? Spirit stick or the stick?
yeah, the talking stick.
The talking stick. I thought, I wonder if that would work in a talk show. Pass it around the table. Who's
It's not a
next?
bad idea. I mean, obviously, don't use an indigenous artifact, but pick one,
Right, right, right.
right? Like, just pick whatever. I teach sometimes when I teach executives how to be better communicators. I want them to think about the conversation like a game of catch. And so I'll give them tennis balls and I'll say, whoever has the ball, they speak, and then you throw it back, hand it to the other person. So, yeah, absolutely.
Senator, you're not holding the ball. You can't speak right now. I'll go with that. That
I
works.
mean, they act like children.
Celeste, it is such a pleasure. It's such an honor. Thank you so much for being in the reporter studio. And you know what? But like I said, I always feel like it's a master class. So I appreciate it so much.
My pleasure. It's always good to talk to you, Luis.
All right, let me stop recording and make sure everything is there. All right. Yeah, no, Celeste. I mean, it's